Hey, what's up YouTube? Today I've decided to make a low effort car video. So, I'm in my car, I'm out running errands, I'm about to go to work, and I'd like to stick with a more consistent uploading schedule because it favors my odds in the algorithm and it also keeps you guys in the loop and it provides a steady stream of content and information for y'all, and that's what I'm trying to do. So, today I've decided, because there's a little topic on my mind, is why communism fell. This is something that many people wonder. It's a question asked by libs who are told by communists that the system's better. They'll say, well, if the system is better, and it really is like a better economic system, then why did communism fall, is why they ask. And the answer may shock and surprise y'all. So, the reason why communism fell, the short answer is McDonald's, Macy's, and Nike sneakers. The answer is fidget spinners, pogo sticks, and He-Man action figures. That is the real reason why communism fell. You see, back in the 1940s, you had a whole generation of people who grew up under ruthless autocracy and fascist theocratic dictatorships all across Eastern Europe. Many of these nations were semi-feudal, semi-capitalist nations, third world countries, where the vast majority of the population were peasants that didn't have shit. So, and then, on top of that, most of Eastern Europe was reduced to rubble after World War II. Eastern Europe was destroyed. So you have an entire population of people who know what it's like to have nothing, who know what it's like to be oppressed, and know what it is to truly be poor and destitute. And here comes the new communist government promising to fix things. So living standards improve. This generation that exists remembers the old times when everything was shitty. So the older generation is happy with the new system because now they have jobs, healthcare, and they got their needs met, and they have a decent quality of life, an above average quality of life, a respectable quality of life. That is what socialism brought to these countries, you know. It took nations that had nothing, that were war-torn, semi-feudal shitholes, and it gave them the comforts and conveniences of a modern life. Not a first world, but a second world life. So, despite the fact that living standards massively improved, there was still a gap between the first and the second world, because the first world had a century head start to industrialize on top of the spoils, the cheap spoils of colonial imperialist plunder to give them access to greater resources. So, you know, an abundant light industry existed with lots of variety, commodities, brands, and consumer goods, and they took notice of this, alright? So, you see all these cheap brands, these consumer goods, the consumerist way of life that did not exist in these socialist countries, alright? And when your needs are met, and your economic security is met, your wants tend to go up and you tend to take for granted the things that you have. Well, cue the 1980s. A new generation is born. New generation of people that were not alive during the time of the czars, that were not alive at the time of the Horthy dictatorship, of the fascist dictatorships, or the theocratic dictatorships of Eastern Europe that existed prior to World War II. This is a generation born into communism that knows the system as is. And, you know, their system did suffer with some shortages. It did suffer with some relative technological backwardness of no fault of its own. There was a technological embargo placed on Eastern Europe, and these people only saw what they didn't have. They didn't take it and factor in what they did have, which was economic security. They just wanted the McDonald's. They wanted the luxury goods, the grocery stores. They wanted the variety access of consumer goods, you know? They didn't have to want to fucking wait in line to purchase things. They didn't want to have to submit a request to have an automobile built for them, a shitty little automobile without air conditioning, that they would have to wait for like a decade for, or a house they'd have to wait for like a decade on a waiting list in order to get. So they came to associate these issues with communism, and they came to associate wealth and freedom with capitalism because they saw what they didn't have and they took for granted what they did have. So that's why this perception of stagnation and breadlines was created within the socialist bloc. Again, no fault of their own because of the embargo, which limited and hindered their technological development, on top of the fact that these countries came from a very poor backward starting positions. And despite growing faster, and despite providing better living standards than they ever could have had they remained capitalist, these countries struggled to provide the consumerist cornucopia. So, I do think human nature did have a hand to play in it. These people in general gravitate not towards the system which creates the most wealth, not towards the system that is most fair and just, not towards the system that is most efficient and best. People gravitate towards the system which they perceive generates the most wealth, which they perceive is the most free, and that they perceive is the best. And they perceived capitalism in these lights because they just saw what they didn't have. So as a result, there was a desire, a sentiment for more. It created an ideological basis for the restoration of capitalism in a lot of these countries. And eventually what happened is you had the rise of weak leadership. The old guard was dying off in a lot of these communist parties. So the old guard died off, the new guard came in, and they were part of this newer generation. And they saw what they didn't have, took for granted what they did have, and they thought capitalism was the cure. So ultimately, what happened in the end was you had ideologically weak leadership that was born in this generation that all they knew was siege, all they knew was the Cold War, and, they meant well, they didn't really know any better, and their theoretical material basis was weak, and that's how you got Gorbachev, that's how you got these other figures, and as a result, they had weak leadership that ultimately betrayed the revolution from above. And despite the fact that many of these countries, many people that lived within these socialist systems just wanted reforms. They didn't, they actually wanted, they didn't know it, but what the people actually wanted was better socialism. They did not want capitalism, but that's what they got, and that's what the Western powers did. They, CIA-backed operatives and compromised politicians with the blessing and backing of the West, who rigged elections, who did brutal, tyrannical oppression of communists in the 90s, and did everything in their power, despite the fact, and in many of these countries, communist parties were winning elections. People got a taste of the immiseration and poverty and the loss of economic security under capitalism, and when they had that taste, they wanted socialism back. So in a lot of these countries, like in Czechoslovakia, in East Germany, in Russia, in Lithuania, communist parties were winning. People were turning out in droves and voting for them in the early to mid 90s. And it took the rigging of elections. It took, political repression, the subverting of democracy by the capitalist powers, the outlawing of communism, the repression of communism, and it took the jailing, execution, and the deportation of countless political dissidents, the dismantling of communist organizations. It took Boris Yeltsin threatening civil war and unleashing the army on the general public to stop communism from coming back. So if you want to know what happened, why communism fell, these were the reasons why. This is a short, quick summary of it, although in the future, I suppose I can do deeper research and give you guys deeper details on the events. Otherwise, I'm going to go inside and I'm going to go get me some dog food. You all have a nice day. Okay, peace out. Bye.